I'll remind everybody, too, as kids are heading out, that part of our worship is the taking of some of what God has entrusted to us and giving it back to Him to further His kingdom, the growth of His church. And if you feel so led to do that, here at Grace, there's a myriad of ways you can do that, including the plate in the back. Or, not plate, boxes. We got new boxes. So offering boxes in the back or online. And pray God will bless that. And at this point, we're going to jump right into our sermon this morning. And instead of having a scripture reader read our passage, we're actually going to be looking, I'm going to give you an overshot of the full book of Ruth this morning. And so instead of having you stand while somebody reads the entire book of Ruth, I thought we could stay seated, and we'll just kind of read some selected passages through the book, and we'll talk about them as we go. Some of you might be saying, why are we not back in the book of John? When are we ever going to get back in the book of John? We started in John, and then we put John on hold, and it seems like forever. So, yeah, we're getting there. Here's what we're going to do, though. Oftentimes, in these final weeks of summer, as we head into, rebooting the fall program around here, sometimes I like to take that opportunity to just remind us together from Scripture why we do some of the things that we do together as a church. The purposes that they serve in our discipleship and in our mission and our attempt to grow up into Christ together. And so I just thought it'd be good to do that again here at the end of this summer as we get ready to launch the fall program. So I'm going to take just a couple weeks. In a couple weeks, we'll talk about, the value of experiencing God's grace in community and having a space, we call them grace groups, where you gather with a group of people who are praying for you and holding you accountable, and where we can confess with one another as we are following Christ. We're going to talk, actually next week, I think, about why Grace Church has for so long and will continue to invest a lot of its resources into caring for and ministering to the young people that God has entrusted to us, our children, our teens. And today, I'm going to highlight a new ministry that is in development here at Grace, and take some time to talk about why we're going to be investing in this new ministry. Grace Church long before I ever got here, has had a long history of ministries aimed at just deep care and compassion for people within the church and in our community. Right, very active deacon board here. We have people here who lead our grief share ministries to care for those who are grieving the loss of a loved one, or we have people that lead our divorce care ministry to care for families that have been broken apart. We have people that lead an effort to supervise and to watch little kids while their parents are in addiction rehabilitation upstairs. We have people here who, for long periods of time, have always had an interest in serving those with certain handicaps or disabilities and are often overlooked in communities. Not to mention just the myriad of you all who, even outside of Grace Church, are very passionate about giving of your life, whether at work or wherever, into caring for others. And, I have conversations regularly with people who have other fresh ideas. There are new things starting at the Kesslers, launching a whole coffee shop ministry aimed at providing employment for people with disabilities, right? And, okay, so here's this other ministry that you've heard a little bit about, and is in just a slow and very careful development here at Grace. And that is a ministry that's going to be aimed at providing more intentional care for orphans, right, fatherless, right? So it's going to be an adoption foster care ministry. And I'm highlighting that one, and I'm going to preach a little bit on that. One, because it's something new that will be in development, in the coming years. A new ministry that could potentially ask a lot of us as a congregation. The other reason I'm preaching about it is because I was asked, actually, have you ever preached about the importance of adoption and foster care ministries? And I was somewhat surprised and convicted to think that over my, 14 years of preaching, now I've actually never preached about the biblical basis for why caring for the fatherless, as the Bible would refer to them, is such an important and vital thing in the life of a church. And so we're going to touch on that today. All to say, that's where I'm going this morning. And my basic intent is to simply answer the question of why. And my goal is to try to show you this morning that the reason why we would invest in that and and be a little bit more intentional about going about that together as a church is not simply because, well, that's just a good and noble thing to do. There's a need there, we should fill it. What I'm hoping to show you is that actually this lies at the very heart of who God is. And this is one of those themes and currents that run cover to cover in the scriptures. And I really want to show that to you, and so I have to work really hard to make sure that we get out of here in appropriate time to show you how cover to cover in the scriptures, this is such a major theme. And also, really what I want to show you this morning, most of you know that we have just ended our own 5-year journey with the legal system in Delaware County, and can officially call 2 beautiful children, George and Jeffrey, officially call them Sussex, right? And so we're thrilled about that. Yes. Yeah. Something we're very excited about, which, by the way, if you're like me and don't always read your e-news every week dutifully, don't tell Pastor Mark. I try to get to that. But we want to celebrate that together with you all. And so on September 16th, am I right on that, Mark? I can't even remember. September 16th, big celebration, fun party that we're going to have. And as you are the broader family of that, we'd love for you to be a part of that if you have nothing going on. The busiest time of the year, September. Anyway, so where was I going with that? Oh, yeah, my intent in the sermon is to share with you a little bit of how God worked that in our own lives and really challenged and convicted me and could have showed me through scriptures of how this really lies at the heart of who he is. We've been in the foster system for, I don't know, the better part of 10 years. And I think we've had, 8 kids come through maybe in that time? You remember all 8? Yeah. Anyway, initially, and it goes back even way before then. When Amy and I were first married, we would have conversations, and I think part of the motivating factor early on is that both of us, were just deeply saddened by the number of young unborn children that had their lives taken from them, before they were ever able to enjoy them or defend themselves, right? And it's part of my cynical nature, though I think there's a theological aspect of it as well, too. I had very little confidence in the government to rectify that wrong, and maybe was a little perturbed at the time that it seemed like the broader church in America felt like it was doing its duty in trying to correct that wrong by simply casting a vote in a ballot box, in November or whatever. And so we felt led to join the effort to provide an alternative to young mothers or to families, right? Hey, we'll open up what God has given to us, a wonderful home, wonderful family. We're happy to share that. That was the original thing. But then as we were kind of working through it, God really just kind of impressed on us and convicted me and us and our family, just that there's actually something much deeper to this, and that it actually lies at the heart of who God is. And that's been part of the joy of that, and that's what I want to unpack a little bit this morning as a means of showing why it can be good and exciting for a church to get behind this sort of thing. And to do that, I want to use the book of Ruth, because that's partly what God used in my own heart and life along those lines. Actually, I have a love-hate relationship with the book of Ruth. I love it because it's a beautiful story, extremely... Oh, there it is. Thought maybe I got cut. I thought that was the end. Great story, but it was one of those books that I had to translate in my Hebrew class in seminary. I had to translate the whole thing. And languages, I'm not one of those people where languages comes naturally. And so that was very painful. So I love it, but I have a little bit of PTSD every time I'm reading through the book of Ruth. So hopefully if I start shaking and pass out, just somebody pick me up and finish the job. We'll be all right. But it is a beautiful story, right? It's a story of tremendous faith and courage and loyalty by a young woman who has literally lost everything in life. It's a neat story of some love, romance. There's actually some very intriguing romance elements in this that we're not going to be able to poke at. Apologies to you who love your romance novels and whatever. It's a story, it's a redemption story. It's a story of, of transfer from heartache and death and grief to life and joy and celebration at the very end. But there's also actually something deeper, well, not deeper, but there's also another deep current that runs through the book of Ruth, and it's this deep current that connects the book of Ruth really with the whole rest of the Bible, and that's what I want to sort of poke at this morning. So let me start reading a little bit for you. There it is. Let me start in the beginning of chapter 1. Gives us the context. It says, if you can follow along, I'll try to give you verse references if you want, or you can just listen as I read. In the days when the judges ruled, I mean, that was kind of a really pretty dark time in Israel's history. There was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. So they went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years, but then both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Okay, let's pause it there for a second. If you want to understand part of the deep current that runs through the book of Ruth, you have to understand just how devastating that last line is. She was left without her 2 sons or her husband. And here's the thing. Ladies, don't shoot the messenger. This is just how it was in the ancient world. If you were a woman in the ancient world and you didn't have a man, your life was going to be pretty hard, pretty difficult, right? Because men in the ancient world, they were your provider. They were your protector. And so to be exposed without a man, who's your provider and protector, right? You were pretty destitute. I've learned a little bit that some things don't necessarily change. You know, we were on a hiking trip, and many of you have heard this now apocryphal story of a bear that we saw on our hiking. Well, I learned very quickly that the man is still expected to be the protector, because as soon as we saw that bear turn the corner, the rest of my family were gone and left me in the back to just sort of, ward off this nice little grizzly guy that was walking down the trail short behind us. Anyway, even more so in the ancient world, okay? If you're a young woman in the ancient world, like, you grow up under the care and the protection of your father. He provides for you, he cares for you, he's your advocate, making sure that you live life as God intends, to the full, right? And then as you grow older, maybe that duty then is transferred to a husband, and you leave your family of origin and you join your husband's family, and he becomes your provider, your protector, your caretaker, your advocate. And if maybe when you get older in age, maybe you outlast your husband dies, well, hopefully then you have a son who can step up to be sort of the man of the house and who can take you under his wing, care for you, provide for you, protect for you, advocate for your life still. In the absence of that, things are not so well. It's not putting it too mildly to say that in the absence of that, it could be a death sentence for you. Or it's not at all putting it mildly to say that in the absence of a provider and a protector, especially if you're a young lady, boy, you are open to all sorts of exploitation, especially in the period of the judges. Man, people would take advantage of you in all sorts of ways. More often than not, if you're a young woman and you have no father, you have no husband, you have no son, chances are your occupation in life is going to be a prostitute, just so that you can have enough resources not to fall over dead somewhere, okay? Now, Ruth has an option. She can go back to her family of origin, right? Her husband has died. She has no sons. She can come under the care of her father if she wants to. Orpah, actually, this is what Naomi tells him. Naomi says, hey, look, I'm going back to Israel. I'm going back to my homeland. But look, you guys shouldn't come with me. I'm too old to bear you any more sons. You know how precarious of a situation it is not to have a father, not to have a son, not to have a husband. You should just go back to your family of origin. Orpah, the one daughter-in-law, does. Ruth famously says, no, I'm not leaving. Where you go, this is verse 16, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Pretty powerful act of loyalty, sacrificial loyalty. She doesn't know what awaits her for that, but she's sticking by Naomi. So they decide to go back to Israel. And now at this point, think about Ruth. Ruth is not only a widow, she's fatherless. That's how they describe it there. And now she's a foreigner, because she's a Moabite going into Israel. And if you know your Bible storyline, especially the Old Testament, that is like the trifecta of misery right there. The fatherless, widow, sojourner, right? This is Ruth. Ruth is all three. So in other words, I can't overestimate how destitute of a situation this book opens up into. So they go back to Israel, and Naomi says, well, we got to eat. Thankfully, it's the end of the barley season, and they're having barley harvest. And Ruth says, hey, you know what? Let me go out into the fields. Maybe I can sort of work behind, some of the family members that are gleaning and harvesting in a certain field. And if they drop some barley, if they drop some wheat, I can come along underneath and pick that up, and maybe they'll let me take that. There actually was part of that in the law, that you were supposed to leave some of that. Maybe I'll find somebody who will let me take whatever falls to the ground. And so she does that. She goes, and she works in one of the fields, and it just so happens, coincidentally, that she works in the field of a guy named Boaz. And Boaz just happens to be a distant relative of Elimelech, Ruth's father-in-law. Boaz sees this strange new lady come working behind his harvesters, and he says, who's the woman in the back? And you say, oh, that's Ruth. She came here with Naomi to care for Naomi. And Boaz, he immediately does three things for Ruth. Boaz, first of all, he comes to her and he says, hey, help yourself to anything in the field. Right? He shows generosity and compassion to her. He says, yeah, help yourself to anything that's left behind in the field or whatever. He invites her to come for dinner. Number two, all right, it's harvest season. Typically at the end of the day, if you're the head of the field, you gather all your workers, you have a nice meal together, right? Your workers are all tired, you help them out with a nice meal. He invites Ruth to come to the meal. And then lastly, he says to her, and hey, Ruth, don't go to any other field. Just stay in my field. And he tells his male workers, don't lay a hand on Ruth. Now, this is significant. He's acting as a protector here for Ruth, because again, if you're a young, single woman, no father, no husband, no sons, basically nobody to back you up, you're in a dangerous situation, and especially in the period of the judges, a whole host of young men who would indecently take advantage of you or whatever. And so Boaz is coming and saying, hey, yes, look, don't go to any other field. You just stay here in this field. And he tells his young men, don't touch that young lady, right? So Ruth goes, hopefully I'm not flying too fast through this story. Ruth goes back to Naomi and says, praise be to God. God, he has blessed us. I found somebody who will let me glean in the field, who invited me for dinner, and and is offering me his protection. He says, this is Boaz. And Naomi says, wow, Boaz. He's a distant relative of Elimelech, who also makes him a kinsman redeemer. And there's so much interesting ancient history in this, but the ancient world had this practice, especially in Israel, where if a man dies, it becomes the responsibility of some of the extended family to take ownership of not only his land, but also his family, so that that name, the name of that man would continue, and so that the land especially would stay in the designations that God originally had for the people of Israel, for the tribes of Israel, for the families in Israel, right? So Naomi says, hey, this Boaz guy, he's one of our potential kinsman redeemers. So she says to Ruth, I got an idea. Let's dress you up a little bit. Let's take off these mourning clothes, these clothes of grief that you have. Let's clean you up. Let's put on clothes that show that you are potentially available for a husband, for a suitor. And then go to Boaz This is where the romance starts to settle in, basically to see if he'd be willing to be our kinsman redeemer and to take you into his family, make you a wife of his. I'll read a little bit of it. So she went down to the threshing floor, where they would beat the barley and the wheat, and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, his heart was merry. She knows just when to go for him. And he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. This is some of the intriguing ancient world romance that I wish we had time to get into, but someday we'll preach through the book of Ruth. Well, if somebody uncovers my feet, I'm probably going to get cold feet and wake up as he did. At midnight, the man was startled, turned over. Behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Essentially a proposal of marriage. And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. For you have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." One problem in the system of the whole kinsman redeemer thing, there was somebody who was a little closer in line to Ruth and Naomi, who had first right of refusal to the land that Naomi and had. So Boaz has to take care of that first. So next morning he goes to the town gates where all the elders would sit. And he gathers the elder together and he calls that kinsman redeemer and says, "Hey, Naomi has returned. She has to sell off her land so that she can survive. You're the next in line to receive that land. Do you want it?" And the guy says, "Yeah, sure. I'll gladly increase my land portfolio here. I'll take it." And Boaz says, "Okay, and in the day that you do this, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite for your wife." And now let me read you what he says. Boaz said, "The day that you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Well, then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take the right of redemption yourself, for I can't redeem this." Basically, what is he saying here? I can't take her for a wife. And notice the reason. It's not because I already got a wife and I can only handle one. I can't handle two, and she probably wouldn't like that. Again, ancient world, we'll get into that some other time. But he says, no, I can't take that wife because that would endanger my inheritance and how my inheritance gets divvied out among my sons, right? Because if I take Ruth as my wife, what happens if she bears a son? Well, now all of a sudden my property and my inheritance now has to be divvied up, not 3 ways, but 4 ways or 5 ways, depending on how many sons and I'm not looking to do that. I'm not looking to put my own family at risk by bringing this woman into my family and whatever sons she's going to have, or whatever. You see that? You with me? I'm flying through this story really quick. Anyway, it all wraps up. Boaz says, "Okay, great. Let it be known here among the elders, among you, everybody else. You have rejected it. I'm going to receive Ruth as my wife, take this land, and be the kinsman redeemer for this family." Long story short, they get married. Shortly thereafter, Ruth has a son. They call him Obed, and everybody is celebrating. Naomi is celebrating because she's been brought back into a family. She now has a grandson who will carry on the name. Ruth is excited, but everybody's excited. And this story of tragedy, heartache, death, and brokenness ends on a note of joy and life and beauty and so forth. That's the book of Ruth. Part I want to highlight is this character Boaz. He's an oddity in Israel at this time. He's a little bit of a shining light in a very dark, destitute time of Israel in the period of the Judges. People weren't all that generous. And the thing I want you to see, or the thing that was impressed upon me, is that Boaz actually is the ideal Israelite. Boaz in this story is everything that an Israelite man, an Israelite family was always supposed to be. From the earliest days where God came to the deliverance of his people, called them to himself, entered into covenant relationship with his people. You go all the way back to when he delivered them from Egypt, and he started to lead them, through the wilderness en route to his land of promise that he was giving to them. He stops off at Sinai, gives them the law, says, okay, this is what it looks like to know me, to live in relationship with me. And as part of that law, I'm going to read for you from Deuteronomy. You shall not pervert justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge, basically take a loan from a widow. But you shall remember that you were once a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. When you reap your harvest in the field, here's part of that law, and you forget a sheaf out in the field, you don't go back and get that. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go back over them a second time. It shall be instead for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you don't strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember, again, that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this. In other words, look, remember, at one point in time, you were slaves in Egypt. You had no advocate. You had no provider. You had no protector. You had no land, you had no hope, you had no inheritance, right? But I came, and I became God to you. I became your advocate. I became your protector, and I delivered you. And I became your provider, and I cared for you all the way through the wilderness. And I even gave to you my beautiful land of promise. So now here's what it means to live in relationship with me. You take what I've given to you, and you look out for the widow, the orphan, the fatherless, the sojourner. And you care for them. You advocate for them. This becomes a major theme throughout the Old Testament. In fact, when you get to the prophets are like God's covenant attorneys. God has issue with his people. And so he sends his prophets to be his prosecutors for his people. And more often than not, I can show you through all the prophets, evidence A, members of the jury, I'd like to submit evidence A for you to consider, is that they have forgotten to care for those without advocate, those without provider, those without defender. Right, the beginning of the book of Isaiah, chapter 1, is the introduction to this grand court case where God says, children I have reared, and yet they rebel against me. The ox knows his master, but my people, they don't know, and they don't know me. Case in point, look at them. They're running around doing all this religious stuff, having all these sacrifices, all these festivals, fasting, raising their hands and crying out to me, as if that was the stuff that I truly desired. And what they're neglecting, nobody cares for the fatherless. The widow's cause doesn't come before them. How the righteous city, says Isaiah, has become a whore, where righteousness used to be lodged in her. Now, everybody just runs after a bribe. Everybody just runs after their best interest. Your rulers are companions of thieves. And he says, no one brings justice to the fatherless, and the widow's cause doesn't come before him. So come now, let us reason together, says the prophet. Though your sins are many, they can be white as snow. Cease doing evil. Learn to do what is good. Pursue justice. Take up the widow's cause. On we could go, right? So Boaz, in a sense, he is what Israel was always supposed to be. Not only does the character of Boaz look backwards, but the character of Boaz looks forward as well, too. I think Boaz is something of a foreshadowing of Jesus himself, right? This Jesus who always was on the lookout for people who were overlooked, or people who were being neglected, or people who, for one reason or another, were missing out on the life and the opportunities that God might have intended for them. This Jesus who literally laid down his life, sacrificed everything so that he could bring people who were running as far away from God as possible back into the family. so he could forgive them, restore them, bring them into the family, so that he could call them brothers and sisters, so that he could share with them the inheritance that was his from the Father. This Jesus who literally says to his disciples, when he's about to return to the Father, but look, I'm not going to leave you as orphans. I don't do that. But I'm going to come to you, and I'm going to be with you by my Spirit. I think Boaz, not only a forerunner of Christ, he's sort of a forerunner of the whole church. Right? The group of people who, as Jesus says, hey, look, my people, those who know me and those who are known by me are going to be the people that care deeply for the least of these. Care deeply for those who are missing out on the life that my Father intended for them to enjoy. I don't know, or you all go all the way to the end. You come to the book of James, where James says, religion that is pure, as he's writing to the church. Religion, look guys, the religion that is pure and undefiled before the Father. Right, the religious practices and activities that bring God joy and he looks upon with his favor. It's not, I don't know, it's not read your Bible and pray 3 times a day and come to church on Sundays, though all those things are very critical in your walk with Christ. What is it for James that is a religion that is pure and undefiled before the Heavenly Father? It's to look after widows and orphans in their time of distress and keep yourself unstained from the world. The rest of the world is living their life trying to get the most, whatever they can. Keep yourself unstained from all of that and take what God has given to you and you visit widows and orphans, the most vulnerable, those without advocate, those without protector, those without provider, and you visit them in your time of distress. Very simple. This is the stuff that is pure and undefiled before the Father. This is the stuff that he looks at with his favor. And that's maybe the point that I just wanted to highlight this morning. The thing that was, very just convicting, but also just very encouraging to me is that you just see throughout all the pages of the Bible that God has a heart that uniquely bends towards those without advocate, towards those without protector, towards those without provider. Or in other words, we could say it this way. The story of the Bible is God creating this beautiful world, a wonderfully rich life, giving it to his people, and then having a heart that bends towards those who are missing out for one reason or another of that life. Right? Why does God say, hey, when you're working in your fields, don't strip it bare. Leave some for the widows and the orphans and the sojourner. Well, he actually answers that, a chapter or 2 before, where he says, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome, who is not partial, who takes no bribe. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Why does he send his prophets? To prosecute his case. Because his people have forgotten who he is. And he wants to remind them, hey, this is who I am. This is at the core of what I'm all about. This is what it means to follow me. Why does he send his own son to lay down his life? Because it's at the heart of God to draw his people back into his family. And why does he send the church and say this is religion that is pure and undefiled? Because this is his heart. And this is something that brings him great joy. That's the core of it. And so then I would just say, why is it that it's great for a church to get involved in this? Because, the order I get, I just want to be doing the things that bring God joy. I want to be doing the things that God is in, right? Because I find myself craving more and more just the experience of God's presence and his power in my life. So I want to be walking, I want to be living, I want to be doing the things that God is doing, the things that bring him joy, the things that he looks upon with his favor, the things that he blesses with his promise. If this is something that brings joy to the heart of God, I think he's going to be in it. If this is something that brings joy to the heart of God, then can you see how this could be a tremendous opportunity to learn actually of who God is? Admittedly, when we got into the foster and adoption program, it was half. We wanted to, provide our home and our family for people who would need it, kids, maybe broader families. But I also had a particular interest in seeing this being a way through my own girls would learn of the heart and the character of God, right? And I don't know if you girls remember, but we would have conversations at Cross Keys Diner, and we would talk, how you doing? How you doing okay with Adam and Brandon living with, at the time, right? And then I would always say, and you remember why we do this? Because this is who God is. And this is the love and the favor that he has shown to us. And through this, you get to learn a little bit about who God is and of his love and his own compassion for you. And I pray that they did, and I pray that they still do in a very powerful way. If this lies at the heart of who God is, and if this brings him joy, can you also see how this can be a tremendous opportunity to show the character and the nature of God even to a broader community that really needs the love of a good father and needs to be brought back into his family? Again, in the development of this ministry, my hope is twofold. One, that it would be effective in maybe making a small dent and providing a home for the couple thousand kids in the Philadelphia area that need home and need love and need care and need someone to advocate for them. But my other hope is that it would increase the reputation of Grace Church in the community, not just so people would look at us and say, oh, wow, Grace Church. No, but that they would look at Grace Church and say, hey, there's a group of people who are excited about, who celebrate this beautiful gift of life that God has given, or beautiful gift of life, and then maybe ask the question, what God is this that they serve? And maybe give us opportunity to say, hey, yeah, I serve a God who is at the heart, who's at his heart is to welcome people into his family. I am one who, at my very core of my identity, I've been adopted into God's gracious family through no effort of my own, through nothing that I have done, but simply of God's own good pleasure. This is the God that I serve. And this is the God I'm delighted to participate with. And so that's the hope. And I want to say, as we begin to close this up, and I want to be explicitly clear about this. I'm not preaching this so that every one of you, or all of your families, will all of a sudden decide to get into a foster and adoption ministry. You all are not. I'm pretty certain that all of you are not called into that, right? God has entrusted each of you, all of you, with gifts by his Spirit, abilities, passions, convictions, and your calling in life is to follow that and to follow God as he gifts you and give those gifts back in service. And to engage in foster and adoption ministry, that will severely cramp your ability to use your gifts in other ways that God has perhaps called. So no, not everybody is called to that. But I think we are called together as a church to do that. And if over the next couple years, maybe just one family would decide to open their home, bring somebody into their home, the goal of this ministry is to have an army of people to come alongside them and to pray for them and to care for them and to provide childcare or whatever the needs are so that they're not doing it alone. To use the old adage, it takes a village, right? That's ultimately the goal of this, is to provide that. Talk to Ben and Danielle Glico if you want to hear more about that. So thankful that God brought Ben and Danielle Glico to our church family, who have a passion for this sort of thing, have led ministries like this in other churches, and are kind of spearheading the effort here. But as we close, and thank you, you guys have hung in with me here for quite a while. This is the last thing I want to say. It is possible that God has laid it on some of your hearts. Maybe open up your home to take of some of what God has given to you and very sacrificially bring others into that. What do I want to say to that? A lot of things. I might say, first of all, if you're ready, I know a beautiful little girl who has been passed around quite a bit in her life and is looking for a forever home. And her mother knows a little bit about Grace Church, has actually popped into Grace Church a few times years ago and gave me a call and wondered if anybody, so anyway, I'll just throw that out there. If you have any questions, come talk to me, whatever. But what I would also want to say to you is that if God has called you into this, I want to just kind of tidy us up with the way the book of Ruth ends. Man, the book of Ruth ends in this almost like surprising plot twist, right? The son is named Obed. And Obed is the father of who? Jesse. And Jesse is the father of who? David, the great king in Israel. And David is the great grandfather of who? Yes, Jesus, but only because Joseph adopted him into his family, right? It's Joseph from the line. But just look what's happening here. Like, God is hardly mentioned in the book of Ruth at all. Like, if you read through the book of Ruth, God maybe is mentioned a couple times. I'll take your God, your God will be my God, and so forth. But the beauty of the book of Ruth, it shows the God who's at work behind the scenes. And he's taking this story of tragedy and heartache and brokenness and death, and through these very profound acts of faith and courage and loyalty and sacrificial generosity, can you see how he is weaving all of this into his grand story of redemption? And I'm pretty sure when you read cover to cover through the Bible and you take notice of the promises that he makes, especially in the prophets, to those who are willing sacrificially to do this sort of thing, I think that promise still holds. That in the mundane trials, struggles, hardship of opening up your home, believe me, there will be days where you will turn to your spouse and you will say, we made a mistake. I know that from personal experience, right? But in those things, I think it's a reliable promise to say that God is at work taking those events, those sacrifices, that story, and weaving it into his grand story of redemption. I have no premonitions that Georgia or Jeffrey are going to become the future Messiah, none of that. I'm just saying, but somehow, and in some way, ways that we might never even know, God is faithful to take our efforts and the things that we do and weave it all into his wonderful story of redemption. Weave it all into this great program of advancing his kingdom. Weave it all into this wonderful mission that he has to show his good heart to a world that needs to see it. Weave it all into this wonderful story of exalting the name of Christ, helping us to grow in our enjoyment, our understanding of who Jesus is, and increase our witness and testimony to his glory. And that's what it's all about, right? So may God lead us in that. May God add his blessing to our church as we start this new ministry, which you'll maybe be hearing things about in the weeks to come. And in all things, may God lead us to having his heart, having his eyes for those without advocate, those without defender, those without provider. And may he always empower us by his Spirit to lead lives that exalt him and his Son and bring all honor and glory to him. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Spirit we ask. Amen.